Well, I want to start today with a question, one that I believe you all know the answer to. It's not a trick question. In fact, I'm going to give you the answer to it right up front. The answer to the question that I'm about to ask is everything. Can you say everything? Everything. Here's the question. What is the faith of the next generation worth? Everything. I asked that question because that's really at the heart of this message series, and it's really at the heart of where we're going today and where we're going next week. And I would pause and say that if you were not here last week, you should know that these messages are sequential, and each week builds from one to another. And so if you missed last week, I'd really encourage you to go back and listen to it so you have the full context for what we're going to be talking about today. Since you can't go do that right now, I am going to do a brief review of where we've been. Seem fair enough? All right. So last week, I brought with me a chart showing how the religious landscape in America has been changing drastically over the last several decades. I brought it with me again so that you can see the visual of how the number of different religious options that we have in America have been changing. Particularly, too, you'll see on the very top red line is the evangelical line. And these are people who, like us, claim to be followers of Jesus, who make disciples, who make disciples, who make disciples, who make disciples, right? You hear that language all the time in this room. I know in other churches you've been to, you hear the similar type of language. And you can see that on the top line. But the one that I really want to get draw your attention to is this turquoise line down below. And this is the no religion line. That is those who fill out a survey and look at all of the religious options that are available, and they scroll through them, and they scroll through them, and they get to the very bottom one that says none of the above, and they check that box. And over the last 30, 40 years, you can see, particularly in the 90s, this no religious demographic started growing tremendously. And as of 2018, it is now the largest of all the other religious options, and it's the only one that's unaffiliated with any of them. And what's interesting about this is the demographic is contributing to this growth in this no religion trend line is largely coming from the 18 to 29-year-old demographic. But what may be interesting to you, and was very interesting to me, is actually when they're saying they no longer believe, when they're actually leaving the faith. There was a study done by the Cooperative Institutional Research Program at UCLA. It surveys incoming college freshmen at over 184 different colleges and universities across the states. It has surveyed over 50 million incoming freshmen. And it's mind-blowing to me to think about this, but this is actually what's happened over the last 30 years with incoming freshmen. Now, I'm going to pause and say this because oftentimes college professors get a bad rap for being the ones who talk our children out of their faith, right? And I think some of them are probably proud of that because that probably is part of the problem. But as we can see in this survey right here, over the last 30 years, incoming freshmen have not yet gone to college yet. In 86, only 10% checked the box no religion. 30 years later, that's grown to 31%, a 21-point jump. In about a 30-year period, there's been a threefold increase in the number of our next generation that are checking the box no religion before they even get to the place where they have left home, before they even get in the car and drive away for the last time. And it's shocking to me. And if you were to survey this group, which many, many have, in fact, you can go online and search in Google or Bing or Yahoo, whatever you use, and you can type in the rise of the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, which is what they have been affectionately called. And you can get more information on this growing issue in America. But if you were to survey them and say, why are you leaving? It all boils down to this. I just don't believe anymore. I just don't believe anymore. I mean, I grew up in church, and I went to the VBSs, and I went, every time the doors were open. My parents took me to everything, and I went on the mission trips, and I went to all that, and it was good. It was good. The people were great. They gave us free pizza. But you know what? When I left home, I just don't believe anymore. And we can blame a lot of different things for this. We can blame the internet. We can blame technology. We can blame social media. We can blame our culture. And probably a lot of those are contributing factors to this. But you know what the real problem is? The real problem is that the next generation is leaving the faith because the home and the church are leaving them unprepared. The next generation is leaving the faith and because the home and the church are leaving them unprepared. Unprepared, you may ask, to respond to the question, why do you believe what you believe? A question, by the way, that our world is not asking them. In fact, nobody's asking them because they don't care what the answer is. It's a question that's happening on the inside and not necessarily even at the conscious level. It's happening at the subconscious level. Why do I believe what I believe? And if you don't have a response for that, how long do we really expect their faith to last? Because our world is actually not asking the question, they're just making a statement. There is no evidence for the existence of God. There's no evidence for the existence of God. And if you grew up in church, you start to feel a little bit of tension. Well, yeah, but didn't the Bible say this and then the Bible say that? But if you don't have in your core, in your heart of hearts, an understanding of why you believe what you believe, how long do you really expect their faith to last? And let me tell you, our answer has been and always will be the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If someone says, there's no evidence for the existence of God, you can respond, well, there's actually the resurrection of Jesus. And here's why the answer. If a man died and he came back to life, then that means that there has to be a source of power outside our time and space that's strong enough to reach inside and raise that person back to life. And concerning whether it's an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, all-loving, and good God, concerning that, well, if the man who died and came back to life had predicted his own death and resurrection, well, I think we should just listen to whatever that guy says. Here's the thing. If we are going to make this claim and we are going to teach that to the next generation, then we've also got to help them finish the race. We've also got to ground them and give them a response, help them get their own response to the question that comes with that answer. And the question is, well, how do you know then that he lives? If you're going to make the kind of claim that someone died and they came back to life, how then do you know that he lives? And I'll tell you, I'm frustrated that we haven't actually helped them finish, and I'm also a little bit embarrassed because I'm part of a church who says that our mission with our next generation is to fuel their faith, to fuel the faith in the next generation. But if we're getting the kind of results that the church at large is getting, I'm incredibly disappointed. If we're not giving them a way to understand and to think about what their response would be to this question, then it's like we've helped them all the way down the field only to fumble on the 2-yard line. And if you're a parent of a child who has left home and left the faith, my heart goes out to you. And I want to be very cautious that it doesn't look like I'm sitting up here with a child, with children who are, this big, talking to a group of people who are, parents of children that are my height and taller, who have left the faith. And so I don't want to present myself at all as if I have the answers. What I want to do is I want to say, hey, can we start this conversation? Can we talk about it? Because where my heart is right now is I feel like we must prepare the next generation with the understanding of why the resurrection is worth believing. If we're going to make that kind of claim, then we must prepare them. We must prepare them to answer the biggest question. Now, my conviction is that no matter where your child is, or where your niece or nephew is, or where your friends' kids are, you can still have an impact on them in their life, whether they're still living under their parents' roof, or whether they've gone on, whether they have moved on and have left the faith already. My belief is that it's never too late. It's never too late for those who have maintained the kind of relationship that would allow them to continue to speak into their lives. And so what I want to talk to you about in today is actually a relational appeal to the wisdom of reason. Now, this problem of how do you know that he lives is twofold. There's two components to it. There is the intellectual problem, and there is the emotional problem. And today, we're going to be looking at the intellectual problem. The problem of being able to respond, well, this is how I know, these are the reasons that I know that he lives. And next week, we're going to look at more of the emotional problem. You good with that? So today, we're looking at the relational appeal to the wisdom of reason. And if you have the kind of relationship that will allow you to continue to speak into the lives of the children that you have been entrusted to, well, then I think you're going to be happy with this approach. If you don't have that kind of relationship, I want to warn you, this approach is probably not going to help. You're going to have to go back and unwind and start over with that relationship. So don't try this at home if you don't have a good relationship with the child who you really want to impact. But if you do, you're in good company, because King Solomon used this approach. And King Solomon is considered by Christians and non-Christians alike to be one of the wisest people who ever walked the face of the earth. And so I want to read to you an excerpt from Solomon to the next generation. He wrote a long appeal to the wisdom of reason. And I want to read to you just a little excerpt from that. Now, before I do, what I don't want you to hear is me reading the words of a man who, you just think is just some boring religious guy who was just sitting around playing his harp wondering, I wonder what I should put in the Bible. Oh, here's an idea. What I want you to hear are the words of a man who grew up as a child, knowing that he was only born into the world because his parents had been unfaithful. What I want you to hear are the words of that child who knew the story of how his father had been so consumed by an idea that reason no longer could penetrate his mind to protect him, to save him from making a terrible mistake. A man who was so consumed by an idea that even after he went through with it, reason still could not penetrate his mind. And he became responsible for the death of Solomon's mother's first husband. And the consequences for him were great. And the consequences for Solomon's mother were great. And the consequences for their family and the nation that they were responsible for overseeing were great. What I want you to hear are the words of a man who, despite knowing the consequences of his father's poor judgment, he too made some very poor decisions in his life. So here is an excerpt from Solomon to the next generation from his own experience. He starts out and he says, "My son." In fact, throughout this whole appeal, every section begins with, "My son, hear me. My son, hear me." This is in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 21. "My son, do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight. Preserve sound judgment and discretion. They will be life for you, an ornament to grace your neck. They will be wisdom and understanding, sound judgment, discretion. They will be life for you. They will be a defining characteristic for you. Then you will go on your way in safety and your foot will not stumble, like mine did. And for the wise people among us who have read that appeal to the next generation, and maybe were part of that next generation when they read that appeal, and they made a conscious decision to embrace wisdom and understanding and reason and to not let them out of their sight, for those wise people among us, I thank you for that, because what you have shown us is a way that we too can protect ourselves from the ideas and the information that is constantly pouring into our minds. The wise people among us who have taken Solomon's advice have created a mental line of defense from all of that information. We live in the information age, where more sources are generating information and more channels are distributing that information to us than ever before. What was true back then is even more true today. That to protect yourself from the consequences of poor judgment, you create a mental line of defense. And that mental line of defense is made up of three filters that wise people use. And in this series, we're talking about each one of those three filters each week. So last week we talked about the first one. This week we're going to talk about the second one, and then next week we'll close with the third one. And so we're in this filter, and I want to pause and I want to tell you this. If you don't believe in Jesus Christ, you can still get a lot out of using these three filters. In fact, they'll help you make better decisions in your life, better relationship decisions, better business decisions, better investment decisions, better parenting decisions. Why don't you consider this for yourself? The first filter that we looked at last week are my sources reliable and do they care about me? Are my sources reliable and do they care about me? And when we apply this filter to the proposition that our primary sources made about the claim that Jesus Christ had died and had come back to life, we found that our primary sources were so reliable that they were willing to endure torture and death so that the world would know, so that you and I would know the one who was resurrected. And these primary sources weren't just made up of people who were biased eyewitnesses who had followed Jesus around. These were made up of skeptics and even enemies who became so convinced that Jesus had died and he had come back to life that they were willing to die for it themselves. And so the second filter that I want to look at this week is actually to help us evaluate that proposition. The second filter is, well, is it the best explanation? When someone gives you advice in your life, when someone makes a proposition that they want you to believe in, that's going to help you make better decisions in your life, they're trying to help you or sell you on something, you've got to ask the question, are they reliable and do they care about me? And is what they're saying, is it the best explanation? And by best explanation, I mean, is it the most reasonable explanation? Because here's the thing, every idea, or nearly every idea at least, is possible. It's possible that we were all just created 15 minutes ago with the memories of our lives intact. It's possible. Is it reasonable? No. And so what the wise people do is they hear the propositions that are made, they hear the advice that is being made, and they evaluate it based on, is it the most reasonable of all of the possibilities? Now, before we get into what those possibilities are, I want to start on some common ground of what everyone agrees with, both people who are Christians, Christian scholars, and secular scholars as well. It's good to help us begin on common ground about where everybody agrees. And then we can evaluate the possibilities from there. So here are a brief list of what everybody agrees to. The first is that Jesus was actually a historical figure, that he actually did walk the earth. I remember thinking when I was in middle school and high school, yeah, but how do we know that Jesus wasn't just some made-up character? Well, the good news is that everybody actually agrees that he was actually a real person. both the skeptics and the believers alike. The second is that he claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that because of his claims and the claims of his disciples as well, he was tried. He was put on trial by the Jews and the Romans. And after that trial, he was sentenced to death by crucifixion. And he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. But on the third day, his tomb was empty. I've heard it said that nobody expected no body. Because if they had found a body, we wouldn't be sitting here today. But everybody agrees that the tomb was empty. But it's on this last point where people start to disagree, is that something happened. Okay, so what we're going to do right now, so I don't want to lose you here, because this is where we're getting into evaluating the proposition that the disciples made, the proposition that Jesus had actually died and had come back to life. Something they were willing to testify and die for. Something they were willing to testify and die for. Nobody thinks that nothing happened. Everybody agrees that something happened. Well, let's look at the possibilities. There are 4 major possibilities that our world puts out as to what actually happened. If you're in middle school or high school, I want you to be prepared. I want you to have an understanding. I want you to be aware of the 4 possibilities that people talk about and that people believe in. And here they are. The first is that it was a conspiracy. The second is that there were hallucinations. The third is that there was a survival of death. And the fourth is that there was a resurrection. Let's look at the first one. The conspiracy idea says that the disciples on the third day had gone and stormed the tomb. They had knocked out the Roman guard, rolled the stone away, taken the body and hid him somewhere, and came back and said, "Hey everybody, Jesus is gone, but we saw him. And you should believe us because, we saw him." But the question you have to think about is, what was their motivation? And that's what we looked at last week. Why would they hold up? Why would they hold up that Jesus had died and he had come back to life? It certainly wasn't that they thought, the kids in the streets would think they're rock stars and want them to sign their sandals and, this is going to be super awesome because we're just going to be heroes and people are going to, bring us all kinds of money and treasure. It's going to be great. You have to evaluate their motive and understand that they were willing to die for what their claims were. The second is, if they were making up a story, this is somewhat of an embarrassing admission on their part because at that time, both in Roman and Jewish culture, the socioeconomic status of women was low enough that you certainly wouldn't have written into the script that women were the ones who first discovered that Jesus had come back to life. There's a number of flaws with this, but we really looked at most of this last week. And the evidence for the conversion of enemies is actually the strongest to help us understand that this one just doesn't make sense. The second is the hallucination theory. The idea that the disciples wanted so badly and expected so greatly that their Lord would come back on the day that he had predicted after his death. There's a couple flaws with this one as well that I want you to know about. The first is that modern medicine has helped us see that it is actually impossible for even 2 people to have the same hallucination, let alone the 500 that were reported to have seen him. The second is this. Again, an embarrassing admission on the part of the disciples. And it's that nobody was there. Nobody was waiting outside his tomb on the day that he had said he was going to come back from the dead. There was nobody there. They didn't expect him to come back. Nobody was there before sunrise watching as it was raising up, counting down 10, 9, 8. And you would think of all the people that might have believed that he was going to be there, you would think that maybe, just maybe, Lazarus would have shown up. Nobody expected it. Again, there's a flaw. Possible? Not really. Reasonable? No way. The next is the survival idea, that Jesus had actually survived the flogging, being nailed to a cross, having a crown of thorns shoved down on his head, and the loss of blood that would have come from all three of those things, hanging on a cross for 6 hours, and then taking a spear to his side. And not only did he survive that, but he survived them taking him down and pulling the nails out of his hands and his feet. And that he survived the embalming process. And that he survived being placed in a tomb for a couple days. And then all of a sudden, he just came out of his coma, and he broke the seal on the tomb and rolled the stone away and somehow presented himself as a victorious Lord. I don't know about you, but this is an insult, not to Christians, but to the Roman guard whose profession was to kill people. Possible? Maybe. Reasonable? Reasonable? No way. Of course, the fourth possibility is that he actually did survive all those things I just said. And then on the third day, when he had predicted, his lifeless body started to breathe. Because of whose son he was. And the evidence that we have for this, going beyond just an empty tomb, is again the conversion of skeptics and enemies, of their willingness to die. We have witnesses testifying, but even greater than that, and this is where we have the benefit of history, is that we can look back and see how the church exploded. And not in the comforts of coming, but in the feed you to the lions, Rome, in all the surrounding areas. In fact, you and I are sitting here today because of the disciples' testimony, because of the skeptics' acceptance, because of the enemies' acceptance, and because the church took off. I mean, can you imagine, even despite the graphic that I showed you at the beginning, there's still, in the 7 billion people who are alive today, a third of them believe in the resurrection. And very few of those are Jewish. Why would you believe unless it really happened? And that's why, if you're in middle school, you're high school, and you're about to transition into the next phase of your life, or someone might say, there's no evidence for the existence of God, you can say, well, I know there's some possibilities, but it seems to me that the resurrection is the best explanation. It seems to me that the resurrection is the best explanation because when I go through all the different possibilities, I don't understand how it can be a conspiracy, and I don't understand how they could have hallucinations. And I don't understand. I believe Jesus was probably pretty tough, but I have no understanding of how he could have survived all of that to present himself as a victorious Lord. And unless you've got some other possibilities, it seems to me that at a minimum, the resurrection is the best explanation. But of course, if you're going to make these kinds of claims and if you're going to walk people through this process, to not even go and show them all the different historical documents that are out there, but to actually help them think through this, then you've also got to be able to meet some of the objections that would come. And there are some common objections that I'd like to walk you through. A first objection that people make, and I think this one is actually a decent one to make, is, but wait a minute, weren't these eyewitness accounts written, many years after the event? Weren't the people who were actually there who are making this claim, didn't they just write that like 20, 30, maybe some even 40 years later? And I would say you're exactly right. That actually is true. But historically, we know that they actually went into the synagogues and into the streets proclaiming and teaching the resurrection daily, up until their own executions. They got pretty good at telling the story. The second thing I would say to this is that there's just some things in life you don't forget, no matter how long ago they were. For me, I can remember 9/11. If you were alive during 9/11, I'm sure that is true for you as well. I can remember watching the second tower collapse. I can remember the conversations that my mom and my dad had. I can remember the conversations my siblings and I had. Clearly, this was a significant event. There's parts of 9/11 that I can actually go back and I can tell you specific conversations that I had. I can remember it vividly. I can definitely tell you about the time where my parents called me and my siblings into the room to let me know that my mom had cancer. I can remember one of my siblings so overcome with emotion that the response was actually laughter, not crying. I remember being frustrated at that because I didn't understand how overwhelmed my sibling was with this news that my mom had cancer, and I can remember the words that they said. I can remember the conversation that I had with my parents on my way to work the morning that I found out about my wife and I having our first miscarriage. I remember that conversation like it was yesterday. I remember going to work, and I remember having a difficult time working all day, so distracted, and coming home and just having that weight of the moment. There's some things you just don't forget, and I'm sure that's true for you as well. And so while I think this is a good objection to make initially, you can see the emotion that these disciples had gone through, and they weren't going to forget it. Another objection is this. Yeah, but what about evolution? The Bible's claim about a 6-day creation. And this is where you know people are starting to grasp for straws, because this is not an objection to the resurrection. This is an objection to the existence of God, because the assumption is made that if evolution is true, then God actually can't be real. And let me tell you, just right up front, that there is no necessary conflict between evolution and theism. Evolution is a scientific theory. The conflict is between theism and atheism. And concerning a 6-day creation, the assumption is made that if the Bible's wrong about it being 6 days, well, house of cards, you pull that one out, the whole thing collapses. And again, that's not true. First of all, if you want to get really technical about the 6-day creation, go back and read the text, because it wasn't until the 4th day that our measurement for time came into existence. Let me read it to you real quick. This is found in Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. The day He created the sun and the moon and the stars. And let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and the days and the years." So the first 3 days, our measurement for time was not even in existence. So the first 3 days, they could have been, like 13.8 billion years. My point is that it's not necessary to defend a 6-day creation, because we have something far better. We have the resurrection of the dead. But what about evil and suffering? Again, this is not an objection to the resurrection. It's an objection to the existence of God. And it's one that moves from being an intellectual objection to an emotional objection. And I can certainly understand when this objection is made by the people who have suffered the greatest because of that evil. And being one who has contributed to the suffering of others, I can understand why this one's brought up, despite it not being an objection against the resurrection. And so since it was brought up, I want to address it. The existence of evil and suffering does not disprove the existence of God. It disproves the existence of a God who does not allow evil and suffering. And the reason that our God allows evil and suffering is because there's one thing our God will never do, and it's take away your ability to choose. You will have the ability to choose good or evil in your life. And based on your choice, there are going to be consequences to that choice. And because I was personally given that choice, I can tell you that there are times when I have chosen evil and others have suffered. And if you've suffered, I'm so sorry. But the good news is that God actually came back. He actually came back. He stepped into the problem. The resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is just part of the process of making things right again. And if you've suffered at the hands of evil people, God will make it right again. The other objection is, well, something else must have happened. And they bring it back to the resurrection, and they say, well, something else must have happened. And that's a fine objection to make if you're going to present an alternative theory to what actually happened. And if you're going to substantiate it with why it's more reasonable than the resurrection. If you are in middle school or high school, or you're a parent of a middle schooler and high schooler, I want you to help them finish well. You don't have to be afraid of considering all of the options for what might have happened. Because what you'll find is that the resurrection is the best explanation. And if you are a parent of a child who is going to be transitioning, I want you to start the conversation with them. Is it heady? Is it intellectual? Yeah, some of it. And some of them won't need that. But in our attempt to prepare them with a response to the claim that they're going to make that a man died and he came back to life, we need to prepare them to respond to the biggest question that comes with that, which is, well, then how do you know that he lives? Well, let's look at the possibilities and see what's most reasonable. And if you're someone who doesn't have children, I want you to call your nieces and nephews and start the conversation with them. And if you don't have nieces and nephews, I want you to call your friends and start the conversation with their kids. And if you don't have friends, or they don't have kids, I want you to come talk to me or one of the other ministers here so we can connect you with the multitude of people who are trying to fuel faith in the next generation to make sure that the kind of statistics we're getting at the church at large, we will not get at this church. I want you to help them to finish well by preparing them with their own response and their own conviction to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And the question that comes with that, well, then how do you know that he lives? And I know that some of this is kind of slow, and you almost have to tread through it. But there's actually another objection. And the other objection is when I just don't believe anymore becomes I just don't care anymore. And that's a bigger objection and a conversation completely separate from today's, which we will talk about next week. If you will, join me in prayer. Lord, as I sit up here, I feel a little bit frustrated. I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated that it just seems like I just put out a bunch of information. Lord, I want the next generation to be prepared. And I pray that those who heard the words today, heard the information, will take that information, will begin the conversation, and that they will do the hard work of preparing the next generation to help them finish well. Thank you for Jesus. Thank you for how he has prepared us, both historically and in our hearts as well. Thank you for his sacrifice. Jesus, I thank you for your sacrifice. And it's in your name, the resurrected Lord, pray. Amen.